hmm Okay, Boker Tov. So today's daf, officially, we should be on Chav Zayin, but we're close to a daf behind, so we're on Chav Vav. And we are in the middle of a discussion of things that, for which people or which situations a person has to do Kriya, and also a Kriya that cannot be sewn up. So we are in the middle of the discussion about hearing God's name being blasphemed, Birchas Hashem, and we are in Chav Vav Amud Aleph. We pick up with where were we? Tanu Rabbanan, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down on the wide lines. There's an asterisk by it, end of the line, Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, our rabbis talk. You have a chair there, Charlie? Okay. Echad HaShomea, whether somebody hears the God's name being blasphemed, Echad HaShomea Mi Pi HaShomea, if a person hears it being repeated. Now, presumably that means not just a report that it happened, but an actual literal repetition of it. Now, who's supposed to actually literally repeat it and say the words again? But if you look at Tosfos, he says, Pirush Tosfos Kugon Min Ha'edim She'omrim Zeh. So if they testify against someone, and therefore they have to actually repeat what the person said, so they wind up repeating the blaspheming again. Chayav Likroa is obligated to do Kriya. Now, when the witnesses repeat it, presumably that's when everybody else heard it because it was being repeated, they don't have to do a Kriya again because they're repeating it. They heard it when they did Kriya when they initially heard this. They heard the blaspheming taking place. So the Gemara says, so okay, who cares if they heard it once? They're hearing it again now from their own lips. So the Gemara says, no, lo sakadaitich. That doesn't make sense, meaning that you would say that. Because the verse says, when the king Chizkiyahu heard, right? This is about the story that we mentioned before, right? About the people who came back and testified to this act that Rav Sheka did, that he blasphemed God's name. So when Chizkiyahu heard it, Vayikras begadav, and he rent his garments. So you see, Hamelach kara v'heim lo karu. So the king rent his garments, but the people that were repeating it did not. It says they came with rent garments. It doesn't say that they rent their garments again. Okay. And how do you know that the rending of these garments under these situations, whether going all the way back to what we discussed yesterday, whether it was the death of a Nasi or Nav Beistin, or national tragedy, or this case of Birchas Hashem, how do you know that it's not sewn up? Minalan. So Asya Kriya, we make Gzera Shava. We learned before by mother and father and a Rabbi that it's not torn up. We learned that from the story about Eliyahu and Elisha. So here too it says to tear, so it's Gzera Shava. Now Tosfos points out, if based on that, anytime that you do Kriya, we would say don't sew it up because of Gzera Shava. So if you look at this little Tosfos, it says Asya Kriya Tema Imke Nelif Kol Kriyas. Anytime you do Kriya, don't sew it up because it always says Kriya, right? So how do you get to choose which one's yes? It says, which basically, that doesn't make sense to apply it other ways. Which basically means that Chazal had an understanding from the beginning which things were appropriate to sew up and which were not, and they sort of chose which ones to say applied this rule of not sewing up. So I find that that's a fascinating little Tosfos because certainly in yeshivas they tend to teach it like all of the drashot are like totally mechanical. But obviously they're not always mechanical. Oh, you got this extra thing that tells you this. But how do you determine what point that extra little letter is supposed to be teaching you, right? I mean, so there's obviously like decisions in every single step of the process in terms of how you're applying it and how and what its implications are. So anyway, Tosfos here basically says, yeah, we can basically say anything you don't sew up. What are we going to apply this principle to? The ones that make sense to apply it to. Okay, so now back to the Gemara. It says,
which has got a subjective.
Yeah, clearly, right. So now also look, there's a whole question here about how much are we doing real drashot? Are we saying that this is all d'oraisa? A lot of these psukim are, so far pretty much all the psukim have been from the Nevi'im, right? Not one of them from the Torah, right? So how much are we understanding that this is like telling us a biblical obligation of Kriya? It's just, informing us of a practice. Is it rabbinic? Like the same by Avelut, right? There's a lot of psukim floating around, but according to some Rishonim, it's all rabbinic. All right, now again, that's here it's worth again pointing out, like by the Kriya aspect, By rabbinic, it might mean in the sense of a technical legal obligation. The fact that this was existed as a practice and as an institution, I mean, that's clear about Avelut, and it's clear about Kriya. So, again, it's interesting here, how much are we sort of learning out what the practice is, and how much are we learning out a technical legal obligation. Okay, so now the Gemara gets back. Sefer Torah shenisraf minalan. How do we know when a Sefer Torah is burnt? That one does kriya and does not sew it up. To see if the verse says, "Vayhi kro Yehudi shalosh telatot v'arba." When the Jew read three sections or three verses or four. This is about the reading of the Megillat Eicha that Yirmiyah had written. Presumably it was the Megillat Eicha. Vayikra abatar hasofer, and the king tore it with basically with a barber's razor. V'yashleich el ha'esh asher al achan, he threw it on the fire, was by the furnace. My shalosh telatov v'arba. What does it mean, 3 or 4? Amalei Yehoyakim. So they said Yehoyakim, because of Yirmiyah Sefer Kinot. Yirmiyah wrote a book of Lamentations, presumably Eicha. Amalu Mike Sivbe, and now we're going to see that is exactly what the Gemara understands it to be, Eicha. What's written by it? Because obviously here they were reading it before Eliakim. They were reading it before Eliakim. He was the king, and it was Yehoyakim. Excuse me. He was the king, and it was saying about how the temple's going to be destroyed and people are going to be taken into captivity. He was not so thrilled with hearing that. So okay. So he said, anyway? So now we're going to hear that a little narrative about that. So what's written in it? So Eicha Yeshva Badad. How did the city, dwell alone? Amrlu, so he said, Ana Malka. All right, I'm the king. Well, nothing's going to happen to me. Amrule, they said to him, Bachosiv Chebalayla. It cries at night. She will cry, Ana Malka, I'm a king. Doesn't affect me. Asayu Damioni, the entire Judea will be exiled from oppression. Ana Malka, I'm a king. Won't happen to me. The ways of Zion are mourning. So there's nobody is traveling on the roads. I'm a king, it won't affect me. What? Its enemies are going to be its rulers, right? Oh, Amalahu, Manamra, says who? So now he's worried, because not him anymore. Says who? Hashem Hoga, because God, is doing this because I've planned this because of all of its sins. So Miyad, God now is doing this to me, and now it's going to affect me? So Miyad, Kadr Kolas, Karak Shaba, he tore out all of the names of God from the Megillah, the Sarfran Be'esh, and burnt them in fire to get back at God. V'hailu Dechsiv, and that's why it says, now going back to the actual narrative about how they read the Megillah in front of him, and it says he burnt it. That was a little sort of like digressions, about actual reading from the book. The people around did not fear, and they did not rend their garments. So you see that the right response is to do Kriya. Okay. Now, well, right. So, of course, by this way, it highlights the fact that it was burning the Shem Hashem, which means that it's not exactly it specifically focuses us on the Shem Hashem, not on the entire Sefer. If you look again at Tosos, he has Kadr Kolas Karot. He says Tema v'had dekara b'tar hasofer mashma kol Megillah. The simple sense of the pasuk is it was the entire Megillah. Yerushalmi lo gasin and has karot. And the Yerushalmi, it does not say that it was dafka the names of God that he burned, which would have focused the concern, changed the focus of the concern. Okay, so now back to the Gemara. So that's about a Sefer Torah that was burnt. So the Gemara says like this. Amalei Rav Papa Abaye. So Rav Papa said to Abaye, Eimer Mishum Shmuas Haros. Maybe it's because of these terrible reports, right? Because we said national tragedy. So this is talking about how the entire people will go into exile. That's a national tragedy. Amalei Shmuas Haros, but he shaitim Yahavu. No, that was just a prediction. The tragic events had not yet occurred. So you wouldn't do Kriya because of the tragic events. It's only when tragic events have actually occurred. Not about something in the future, something that has already occurred. Okay. Amar Rabbi Chava, Amar Rav Huna, Haroa Sefer Torah shenikra chayav likra shtei kriyot. If a person sees a Sefer Torah that's torn, the person has to do two rending of the garments. Achad al agvil v'achad al ktav. One for the parchment and one for the script. Shene'emar acharei serof hamelech et hamegillah ve'et hadivarim. After the king burnt the actual Megillah, the parchment, the scroll, and the words. So the very words themselves, are is part of the reason. It's obviously it's not just the physical embodiment of it, which it seems to be the point that it's not just the physical embodiment, but it's the complete, as if the attempt to destroy the content of it and the words of it is also at least an equal reason to do kriyah. Yes.
Would this apply as a halacha if the sefer were torn on the seam where it's sewn?
No, and not only that. Let's take a look at the next story, which will partially answer that from a different perspective. But that's a good point. But what if it's torn and if it's not burnt, and what if it's only the parchment without the words, right? Rabbi Yav and Rabbi Rav Huna bar Chia. So now we're going to see a story that partially answers that. Rabbi Yav and Rav Huna bar Chia have a yasvi kamei de Rabbi Abba, which so that's it doesn't exactly fit because it was Rabbi Abba was in front of Rabbi Abba. Let's see. There's a switch of the girsa here. No, they take out Have Yasvi Kamid Rabbi Abba. It just says Kam Rabbi Abba. Okay, so Rabbi Abba got up, by Lafnuye, and he had to go to the bathroom. Shakli the Totafte, so he took off his tefillin, because obviously they were sitting all day wearing tefillin, and Achasei Abeisadi, and he put it on his scarf. Osei bas na'amisa, an ostrich came. I think that's what bas na'amisa is. Is that what they translated? Ostrich? An ostrich came. The ostriches eat everything. So, and it wanted to swallow it. So, Amar, he said, Hachi chayvin li shtei kriyos. So, now, I presumably it didn't swallow. It sounds like now I would have been obligated to have done 2 kriyos had it swallowed my tefillin, because it would have destroyed it. It's like destroying a Sefer Torah. So now it's interesting. It's not an entire Sefer Torah, right? What constitutes a Sefer Torah? But actually, it's got Shem Hashem, if you want to have that emphasis from the previous discussion. Amalei, so Rabbi Huna bar Chia said back to me, where do you get that idea that you'd have to do Kriya? You know what? The same thing happened to me, that an ostrich swallowed my I don't know. Anyway, or something similar happened to me. And I came to Rav Mas. He didn't know the answer. He came to Rav Yehuda. And he said to me, Shmuel, this is what Shmuel said, Lo amru ela bizroa uk'ma'aseh shahaya. That's only when it was done like with violence, with force, and like the story that happened, where it was like, sort of willfully burnt and destroyed by, as opposed to here, where it's like a natural occurrence. Now, what's the significance of zroa? So, related Gershom here says bizroa means she'ein yachol hatzilo, that there would have been no way, even if somebody had been present, to try to save it. As opposed to the ostrich, if you're there, you can chase the ostrich away, but you can't chase the king away, which is interesting. Like, why does it care if somebody could or couldn't have saved it? At the end of the day, it was destroyed, right? So the Tosfos here quotes the Yerushalmi. He says, "Yerushalmi garas lo amar lebizroa shesarfa melech Yisrael bizroa," right? Which seems like it's not just so much it couldn't be saved, but it seems like it was like a willful, act from a power, from somebody who's in power. So it's much more of a sense of like a willful destroying of this, and obviously, a denigration of it. So an act of violence is done to it. Okay, so Ari Yehuda Minolan. So that's about a Sefer Torah, and exactly what the parameters of Sefer Torah is interesting from this discussion of tefillin. Now,
just some commoner.
Right. Okay, but it could still be an act of violence.
National.
Maybe, according to the Yerushalmi. Ari Yehuda Minolan. Where do you know about the cities of Judea? Presumably seeing them in their destroyed state, and their state of destruction. The verse says, "Vayavona shimishchem Shiloh mishamron," and this is after, in the immediate aftermath of the destruction. People came from Shechem and Shiloh and Shomron. Shmonim ish, 80 people, meguchei zakan, they shaved of beard, the kru'ei begadim, and rent garments, umitgodedim, and which you're not supposed to do, right? Which like lacerated their flesh. Uminchav levona biadam lavi beit Hashem, and with with these very sacrifices to bring to the house of God, which of course had in the wake of the destruction, which is obviously a whole fascinating phenomenon. Am Rabbi Chelbo Ma'ula Biram Rabbi Linzer. Okay, so that's the verse. So you see that what they did as the response to the destroying of the cities was that they did these tremendous acts of mourning. Of course, it was quite excessive, which the Gemara is going to get back to. Okay, but let's take a look. Let's look a little bit further. So the Gemara says like this. 1 minute. Yeah.
So we're learning one of the things you're supposed to do from the other.
Okay. No, so take a look at Tosfos. Tosfos says like this. Maybe you need like all three, Shechem and Shiloh and Shomron, to all be destroyed, right? So it says no. That's not even a Havamina, because presumably I know, because presumably each one of the people was from a different city. So anyway, but what is problematic is not that you need all three cities to be destroyed, but maybe this is excessive. Because like being shaved, I mean, you're supposed to not shave your hair now, and lacerated flesh. So basically Tosfos says no, because basically they wanted to learn something out of the verse. So therefore, rather than reject the whole verse, they right again sort of choosing what to learn. We learn the idea of kriyah. But obviously here there is this problem that they are clearly what they're doing is excessive. Okay, so Amar Rabbi Chelba, but we're choosing what to learn from it. Amar Rabbi Chelba, Amar Ula Bira, Amar Rabbi Linzer. Back to the Gemara. Haroa Ara Yehuda b'Chorbanam Omer. Somebody sees the cities of Judea in their destroyed state. So again, what you also could have said is maybe only if you experience them being destroyed, not if they've been destroyed for like decades and centuries, right? That also, it's like it's old news. I know you're seeing it and you're experiencing it. But again, to learn from the verse that if you see it as something after it's happened, many, many years ago is also a huge chiddush, not based on the verse. So anyway, but here he's now saying it very explicitly that you don't have to experience them being destroyed. If you see them in their destroyed state, Omer, you say, your holy cities have become like the wilderness, v'korea, and then you do kriya. Yerushalayim b'chor banan, if you see Jerusalem in its destroyed state, Omer, Sion midbar hayasa, Zion became a wilderness, Yerushalayim shemama, Jerusalem a desolate place, v'korea, and you do kriya. Beit hamikdash b'chor banan, and if you see the temple in its destroyed state, Omer, Beit kachenu v'tifartenu asher hilucha v'oseinu hayalis refat eish. Obviously all of these are psukim from Yeshayahu. The house of our holy house and our glory, which our forefathers had praised, has been something that has been destroyed by fire. And all of our desirous things have become to destruction, the Korea, and do Kriya. And this actually is brought down in the Shulchan Aruch. This is actually brought down not in Hilchos Avelus, but it's at the end of Hilchos Ta'anit, where it deals with all the things that, because major reasons for the fast days are related to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Korea al Mikdash, we'll talk about these in a minute. Korea al Mikdash and Mosif al Yerushalayim. Person does the Kriya on the Beit HaMikdash, and then when he sees Jerusalem, he adds to the Kriya. Of course, it's a little funny. How did that order work out? So the Gemara says, Raminu, I'll ask you on this. Echad HaShomea v'echad HaRoeh, whether person heard, now presumably this is not heard the new news of the destruction, right? Not heard the fact that they were destroyed. One imagines that that's not. Or if one sees it. So again, it's funny, right? Because the original framing was after it had immediately occurred. And that's where Echad HaShomea is coming from. But now we're including HaRoeh, which is having seen them in their destroyed state, even from many, many years ago. So whether you heard that it was destroyed.
Okay, so these two different things. One is you heard it's destroyed now, the other is you see it later.
Yes. Okay, so that's number one. Now, Kivan Shigil Tzofim, and this presumably is when you are seeing it. So at what page when you see it does one do Kriya? When you get to HaTzofim, okay, so Korea, then you're able to, see Yerushalayim, so you do Kriya. The Korea al Mikdash bifnei atzmo, va Yerushalayim bifnei atzma. And you do Kriya for the Mikdash by itself and Yerushalayim by itself. So here we've got, one explicit contradiction, which isn't the one you were probably thinking, which has that you don't do one Kriya and add to it, your Korea on the Mikdash, and you add to Yerushalayim, but you do a separate Kriya for each. So that's the real focus that the Gemara is making. It's not one Kriya with adding, but it's a separate Kriya. But also the simple sense here is that you're first coming in through Yerushalayim, which anyway you could have asked even without the Brisa. So let's see what the Gemara answers. So the Gemara says, Lo kasha, it's not difficult. Hatapaga b'mikdash b'reisha, hatapaga b'Yerushalayim b'reisha. If first a person encounters the Beit HaMikdash without Yerushalayim, he was airdropped in, okay? Doesn't explain how. Rabbeinu Gershom sort of says how. Literally, you have to imagine, basically, exactly, he was like brought in a box. He was brought in a box. Okay, so you have to imagine that. Anyway, if somehow magically a person first was born in the, saw the Mikdash before, never left his house until he, anyway, I guess. Anyway, all right, then he does Kriya on the Mikdash, and since the Mikdash is the more severe one, he can add to it for Yerushalayim. If a normal person is going through Yerushalayim to the Mikdash, he does one Kriya for Yerushalayim, and then because Mikdash is more severe, it should not just be secondary to the Kriya that was already done for Yerushalayim, so that requires an independent Kriya for the Mikdash. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan, Rabbi's taught. So all of these we were saying are not just things you have to do kriya for, but that you do not fully sew them up, like you don't reweave them. So here it's saying, yes, you can sew them in different ways, you can, but you cannot really do what's called ichoy, which is a completely making it of it whole. So sholan, molan, all of these are like loose types of stitches or various types of, threading of it together, but not a min sulamot, like a ladder is like, having like rungs, so it's not tight. Like there are stitches that are holding the two halves together, but they're well spaced from one another. Various types of ways of stitching it together you can do, but not to do a tight stitching and really make it whole. Amar of Chisda said Rav Chisda will be Ichle Alexandri, and even the type of a stitching that's problematic is only the Alexandrian stitching, which is really one of making it whole again. One imagines that it's close to like a reweaving of the garment. Tanu Rabbanan. Hakoreh mitocha shalal, mitocha malal, mitocha leket, mitocha sulamot. So all these words parallel the words we had before of acceptable ways of restitching it. So if a person went ahead and restitched a kriya with these various stitches, which we have just learned before, are not considered to have made it whole. And then a person goes ahead and does a kriya to re-rend the garment, to sort of break out, to tear those stitchings, lo yatzal. One does not fulfill their obligation, because the whole point is that those types of stitchings do not make it whole. So one did not do a kriya on a whole garment. One did a kriya on something that was already considered to be rent. However, mitocha ichue, if a garment had been really, rewoven, restitched together. Now again, let's say it wasn't something that you're not allowed to do ichue for. It was for another relative, in which you're allowed to do ichue, or it was just something had accidentally torn. It wasn't an act of kriya. The garment tore, and somebody had restitched it in a tight way to the point where it did this ichue, which was considered now that it's whole. So now you've got a whole garment, and then you do a kriya on a whole garment. Then yatzah, you fulfill your obligation. Amar Rav Chisda, here too, Rav Chisda says it would be ichue Alexandri, only if it's the real Alexandrian ichue. So that's a chumra and a kula, right? When it comes to having rent the garment for a father or mother, it's only prohibited if you do the ichue Alexandri, this really full stitching and weave. When it comes to the question about is the person yotze, if they rent something that's been rewoven, then it's only if it's been rewoven in this very full stitching, this Alexandrian ichue. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan.
If you do the same spot, do another spot.
Right, it's the same spot, correct. Tanu Rabbanan. R'shai lahofcho lamata v'lachoto. Now here's a shocking thing. A person can actually turn the garment not inside out, but like upside down. I mean, if you want to imagine, it's like pretty much like a straight tunic. I guess one could imagine you could flip it over and you do enough sewing on the top.
Maybe it is inside out. Inside out.
Because we're not lamata. So then you can't sew it up, because now that's interesting, because then it becomes a different part of the garment. It becomes the hem. It no longer sort of represents, in the way the garment has been reshaped, it no longer represents the kriya, right? It's just some tear at the hem, right? You're not yotze kriya at the hem, so no longer it's in the place of the garment that it represents the tear. And therefore, since it no longer has that weight, it can now be sewn up, which is pretty funny, because you could say, then what allows you to turn it upside down and to transform it in that way? But, I mean, I think, this goes back, to the point that Seth made yesterday, that obviously the symbolism of totally sewing it up, like making it whole, is something that can never be made whole. So, if you didn't, this is sort of like an indirect way, because you never directly said, I'm going to make whole, this rend. this sort of, this symbolic rend. It's just it stopped being that rend because it became something on the hem of the garment. So fascinatingly, that's according to the Tanna Kama allowed. Rabbi Shimon Eliezer says oser lachota. Rabbi Shimon Eliezer forbade it, and as you can see by the little letter, that's how we rule. So no, I'm sorry. Wherever it's located, you cannot sew it up. To do this tight weaving of it. Okay, shame, not sister. Shame shamocher asur lachoto. Now the same way the seller cannot, the person who did the rending, kachalokeach asur lachoto, the one who purchased it, it has to remain this way. As we would say in brisker terminology, it's a halacha not just in the gavra but in the cheftza. Okay, so the object, no matter who's handling it, that has to be the status that one does, like leaves to respect that status of the garment. Now, there's an interesting question, and therefore, if you sell it, you have to tell the person, you should realize this was a kriya that was done, for whatever purpose, for parent or whatever, and therefore it's not allowed to be sewn up. Okay, so again, Tosos asks the fascinating question, like he asked a similar question by Birchas Hashem, what about a non-Jew? Right? If you look at Tosos, he says, Lo shamati mutter lemochro lenachri. Can you sell it to a non-Jew? Right? So is it that you, the one who did this, have to make sure that the garment is never, fully sewn, and therefore it doesn't matter who's doing the sewing? Or is it that no, since the other person is a Jew and follows halacha, they have similar types of rules that apply to them? So he says, maybe we should say that if he's a non-Jew, it's allowed. When the seller has to tell the purchaser, is it because the seller is responsible to make sure that wherever the garment might be, it never gets sewn up? Or is it because he's responsible for the halachic observance of the purchaser, and the purchaser, if he's a Jew, has to follow the halacha? Okay? But maybe we shouldn't be concerned. He says, it would seem that it might be permissible. Then if you look at the side, the asterisk says, but in Maseches Machos, which is one of the Tana'itic collections of areas about Avelis, it actually deals with this, and it says that it's forbidden. Okay, so anyway, that's fascinating in terms of how much is it fully a status of the Cheftza. Tanu Rabbanan, back to the Gemara, about 8 lines down. Hatchilas Kriya Tefach. The beginning of the Kriya, how far does the Kriya have to be? It has to be a Tefach. Now we talked by Aviv and Imo was actually Galet Libo until the heart is exposed, but let's assume now we're talking not about Aviv and Imo. It has to be a Tefach. The Tosefes Shalosh. Now, what if Chas v'Shalom? What happens? Shalosh Etzbaot. What if after somebody heard, like a brother died, they did Kriya, and then in the middle of the Shiva they heard that a sister died. So then they wouldn't have to do enough. Interesting. We talked before, right, about whether if you start on the Mikdash, you could add to Yerushalayim, but if you start on Yerushalayim, you have to do a separate one for the Mikdash. So presumably, if the second one is of greater weight, it gets its own Kriya. So we're going to come up to that, right? Because the same way you have Yerushalayim one and Mikdash is separate, you would have, let's say, a sibling would be one, and then a parent would be a separate. It could not be an addition. But if things are at the same level, it could be an addition to what was already done. So a person did a kriya of a tefach on, let's say, one sibling, and then heard about another one, and therefore they can add, number one, and they don't have to do the full amount. They can just add 3 tefachim, because then it just, the end result, even though the act of kriya, it tore less of the garment, but the garment itself is fully torn, because it already had a tefach to begin with. So that's the first opinion. Divrei Rabbi Meir, that's what Rabbi Meir said. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Tchilas Kriya Shalosh Etzbaot v'Tosefes Kosho. The beginning only has to be 3 etzbaot, not even a full tefach, which is funny because before we had been saying a tefach, but the addition can be even a small amount, again, because it results in a torn garment of appropriate size. Amar Ula Haloch Rabbi Meir b'Kriya. We will like Rabbi Meir by the initial Kriya, which is a tefach, which is what we've all said until now. Haloch Rabbi Yehuda b'Tosefes. We will like Rabbi Yehuda by the Tosefes, that it is a little addition, and for the reason I said. The act doesn't have to do an act of tearing a tefach, even a small tearing, as long as it results in a significant enough torn garment. So once the garment already was torn a tefach, even a little small additional tearing would count for a second avelut. We taught similarly. Rabbi Yossi Tchilas Kriya Tefach v'Tosefes Kosho. So Rabbi Yossi here now says this compromise position. The beginning is a full tefach, not three etzbaot, 3 fingers width, but the addition is only a small amount. Tanu Rabbanan. Now you might be asking, don't we always go by the more lenient opinion? So hold on, the Gemara is going to get to that. Tanu Rabbanan, a rabbi's taught. Amulo Meis Aviv. Somebody was informed that his father died, V'kara, and he did Kriya. Meis Beno, and then afterwards he was informed that his son died. I mean, it's so tragic, these circumstances. V'hosif, and then did an addition. Because again, if the second Kriya is of equal or lesser weight, I mean, sorry to frame it that way, but that's the halachic status here, then it can be added to the first Kriya. So therefore, in this case, again, as we've mentioned before, clearly the death of a child is much more tragic, in most, than the death of a parent. But halachically, the death of a parent has this weightier status because of kibbud av v'aim. So therefore, this one, because it is not a parent, can be an addition to the kriya of the parent. So the person did the kriya on the parent and then did an additional kriya on his child. So in that case, vosif tachton mitacheh elyon eino mitacheh. This is like a hybrid kriya. So the bottom part, the additional part that was torn, has a status of a kriya that can be sewn up, and the top part, which is one for the parent, for the other, cannot be sewn up. So the kriya itself has two statuses based on which section we're talking about, the top section or the bottom section. Meis beno v'kara, just wait. The son died and he did kriya. Meis aviv v'hosif. And now it says the father died and he added on it. Now that's going to be interesting because the idea that you're allowed to do a hosafa, as I've been saying, that should not logically have been the case. So we'll get back to that. El yom mitacheh tachton eino mitacheh. So the top one, which is for the son, can be sewn up. The bottom, the additional, which is for the father, cannot be sewn up. Meis aviv, meis imo, meis achiv, meis achoso, okay, which is like horrific, right? So the whole family has died. Korea kara echad lekulan. So apparently he heard all about this at one time. So in this case, it's one kriya forever. The person does not have to do hosafot unless they're sequential. Chas v'shalom, in this case, where it's all at the same time, one can be for everyone. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera Omer. Now, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says more in line with what we said before about Yerushalayim and the Mikdash. Al kulan kara echad, al aviv imo kara echad. No, you have to separate. A person would have to separate the kriya for father and mother and the kriya for the others. Lefi she'ein mosifin al kara aviv imo, because you cannot, do add on the tearing for aviv imo. So what does that mean? So my time. What's the reason? Because you're not supposed to add to them, which is not very helpful, right? Because why are you? So because you can't. What is that supposed to say? So there's a whole Tosfos trying to figure out exactly what that means. But anyway, we won't sort of try to. It's a little complicated what Tosfos does to try to explain how that's actually adding something. But here he's actually saying that there has to be a separate one. Hold on, I think I said it wrong a minute ago because I think I said it incorrectly because the halacha was the halacha by Yerushalayim and the Mikdash is that if a person starts with the Mikdash, they can add for Yerushalayim. If you start with the more serious one, I apologize. I think I reversed it. If you start with the more serious one, you can add for the less serious. You cannot do the reverse. You cannot make the more serious one a secondary. You can't start with the less serious and make the more serious one like an add-on to that. That was what we know from the Mikdash and Yerushalayim. I might have said that wrong here, so I apologize. So the case here, according to this, at the end, the first opinion is that it doesn't matter. You can always start with one and add the other, and then either the top or the bottom could be sewn depending on which one was for the father and mother and which one was not. That was the first opinion. The second opinion was, like we said, by Mikdash and Yerushalayim, that Aviv and Imo, has to, no, it is different than we said before. It is different than we said before. Before we said you can start with the Mikdash and add for Yerushalayim. And here he's saying you start with Aviv and Imo and you can't add to it. So it's actually different than we said before. Here he's actually saying that you start with Aviv and Imo and you can't add to it, even though by something like Mikdash and Yerushalayim you can. So it actually is different than we said before. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Amar Shmuel says halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. We rule like Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira that a person would have to do a separate kriya for mother and father and a separate one for other relatives. Umi Amar Shmuel, Alchi did Shmuel really say this? Amar Shmuel, Halacha Kedibri Ameka Ba'avel. We rule like the more lenient approach, and here it's requiring a separate act of kriya. So the Gemara says, important statement here, Avelus Luchud, Kriya Luchud. There's a difference between Avelus and Kriya. As we've been learning, Kriya exists even outside of the context of Avelus, and Kriya exists even before Avelus begins. Right? Kriya exists at the moment of death. I mean, again, we tend to postpone it and so on, but halachically, Kriya, is a separate phenomenon from that of Avelut.
Is that practice today, to your knowledge, like upon hearing, people will?
Some people do. I mean, that is the real halacha, but again, very often we postpone it to the funeral. Yeah. Okay. So now. Adheichen korea. So how far does the kriya go? Meaning, we've already said a tefach. We've said, although not here, but we said elsewhere, that by aviv and imo achi galet libo, to reveal the heart. But here the question is different. Since we are talking about the sort of tragic circumstances of adding to a kriya, so the question is, at what stage would the kriya have gone so far, that you can't continue to add to it? Like the person would have to start a kriya in another place on the beged. Okay, so let's say somebody because after that point it's no longer significant to be adding to be it's already like a completely torn in half. So an act of tearing requires some sense of wholeness to perceive the act to have the tearing have significance. So on heichen hu korea ad tiburo, until the belly button. So if it's rent all the way to the belly button, somebody got out of hand, or chas v'shalom, there were many deaths, and then after that point, the person couldn't do an additional kriya. You'd have to go to a different place on the beged. V'yeshomim ad libo, until the heart. Although there's no proof, there's a hint. The verse says, rend your hearts, not your garments. So somehow that's a hint that, that the rending of the garment stops once the heart is exposed or something. Higiu l'tiburo, back to the Tanakhama's position that it goes to the belly button. If a person did so many rendings or got out of hand with one rending, got to the belly button, and now Chas v'Shalom has to do another rending, marchik sholosh etzbaot, so you move sort of horizontally, 3 finger widths to a side, the korea, and does another kriya if that's needed. Nitmaleh milfanav. So again, these are so tragic, imagining these circumstances. If the garment is filled with tears in the front of it, he's been moving 3 tfachim and it's now filled with tears. So machzirola achorav, then he reverses it, and then he has a new front to his garment, what used to be the back. Nitmaleh milmala. Let's say all the top of the garment, front and back, is filled with tears. Hofcho milamata. So turn it up, upside down, and now that, like we had before, somehow you can reverse it so that the top becomes the hem and the bottom becomes the top, and now there's more spaces to do kriya.
The person basically had like one piece of clothing.
Yeah, well, that's true also.
Large wardrobe.
Or you don't want to ruin more than one piece of clothing. So, okay. And what was sort of implicit all along here, if one does kriya from the bottom or from the sides, lo yatsa, it's not yotze, it has to be from the top, from the neck of the garment. That's just a symbolic significance. Why? That's the cultural significance. Also that it's opposite where the heart is, but it also, it's more all right, it's more visible. Okay. Ela shekohen porei milamata, but a kohen gadol, who's not supposed to rend the garments, can rend it below, dafka, because that's not considered to be a rending of the garments for avelut. Okay, Pliba Rav Masna Mar Ukva v'Travai Mishmei Davud Shmuel. So Rav Masna and Mar Ukva, both of them in the name of Shmuel, debated this. V'Levi in the name of Shmuel and Levi. Chadamar Kol Shiva Korea Lachar Shiva Mosif. All Shiva, a person who hears about who's sitting Shiva for one relative and hears about the death of another, will do a. Yes, I'm right. Okay, so the person was sitting Shiva for one relative and hears about another one, so we'll do actually a different kriya. So this is taking a different position about when the mosif is allowed. That during the first week of Shiva, according to this, you would have to do a different kriya because the first kriya is still considered sort of we'll see. The other one says, after Shiva Mosif. After Shiva you could add. Now the logic here is the following, is that since after Shiva a certain amount, well depending on mother and father or others, but it's allowed to be sewn up, So since the original kara can be sewn up now that Shiva is over, so to some degree, it's considered to be, even if it has yet to be sewn up, it's considered to be no longer its status as being a full kara, right, as full torn, because it can be made whole now. And therefore, doing an active kriya is significant. But during the first week, when it's not allowed to be sewn up, doing an active kriya is like it's already a kara. What's the active kriya that you're doing? But after the first week, where it can be repaired, it's significant now to be doing a kriya on something that is standing to be repaired. That's the first position. Again, this is different than we said before, because Michael is right. Before it sounded like a person is just mosif right away, and here we're finding about that it's only after a certain time period where the mosif has significance. So let's take a look. The other one says kol shloshim korean. Same idea, but is even more strict about when another hosafa can be done. Entire 30 days, you have to do a person would have to do a separate kriya. Only la'achar shloshim mosif. Only after shloshim can it be added to. Is the first kara considered to some degree in a state of being repaired? Maskif Rav Zera, so Rav Zera asked on this. Mandamar kol shiva korea amai. The one who says that kol shiva person has to do a different kriya. Why? The lo nitan l'shola, because during shiva you're not allowed to sew it up. So therefore, it's already a full powered kara. So what does adding on it mean? Adding on it would not be significant. Elahadam or mar. So according to that, if that's the logic, why you can't do hosafa during the first week, because it's considered to be a full, a full kriya. So that which we taught, that a woman is allowed to sew it up right away, even during shiva, so as not to be exposed. So hachanami. So would you say that for a woman she can do a hosafa during the first week, because for her the rend in the garment is considered fit to be fixed even during the first week? It says no. Hasmishum kvod isha. That's in order to respect her dignity, but that's not because the tear, sort of on its own terms, is really fit to be fixed. It's something we'll allow for her dignity, but it's not something that's about the status of the tear. The tear, in terms of its own status, is a full tear, and doing another kriya on it would not be significant. Mandamar kol shloshim, but now we see the Gemara has exposed what the logic is. When the tear cannot be repaired, it's not meaningful to extend it. Only when it's in a state of being repaired is it like that it's no longer really fully a kara, and then another act is significant. So now the Gemara says like this: Mandamar kol shloshim korea amai dilo nitan lachoto. So the one that says all shloshim, you have to do a separate kriya. Why? Because the difference between shiva and shloshim is after shiva you could sew it, but after shloshim you can fully repair it. So at what stage is the tear considered to be in a different in a different stage that it's meaningful to do a kriya on it? Once shiva is out and it can be sewn, or only once shloshim is out and it can be fully repaired? So he says the one who says shloshim wants it to be in a state where it's fit to be fully repaired before you can do an additional act of kriya on it. So elo la'avi v'li'imo, according to that logic, for mother and father, that even after shloshim a person is not able to repair it. Hachanami, would you say that you can't do a tosefet on that? The answer might be yes, but the Gemara assumes that you could do a person could do a tosefet on aviv and imo after shloshim. So the Gemara says, Hasa mishum kvod aviv imahu. No, there it's somewhat like the opposite. Right? By the woman, you're allowed to, the woman can sew it up, but in its own terms, it's not deserving of being sewn up. So therefore, it's not meaningful to do a kara. Here, by the aviv and imo, it's the reverse. On its own terms, it's deserving to be sewn up. But in terms of out of respect for mother and father, we don't sew it up. So since somehow, though on its own terms it's deserving, to do an act of kriya on it after shloshim would be significant. So this is quite fascinating. You can imagine that the briskers love this, because it talks about like the status of it as a cheftza, is it fit to be sewn up, as opposed to the allowance for me to sew it up or not to sew it up, and those are not exactly the same. But again, what's interesting here is not only, as Michael pointed out, that before it seemed like just, do an additional tearing. Here we find that there are these limits after shiva, after shloshim. Also, there's a position before that by aviv and imo, you're never allowed to add to the kara, and here it sounds like after shloshim you are. The Gemara at this stage could have said, Einochinami, by aviv and imo, you're not allowed to add, right? So it's a little bit funny what that answer was, yes.
I was going to, just getting back to what we mentioned earlier about Arei Yudah. I was wondering just how applicable that is today, because when everything's rebuilt.
Yeah, so basically nowadays, I don't know anybody who does kriya on Arei Yudah to say that those are b'chor banam or on Yerushalayim. I mean, who knows? There might be some. Now the mikdash when the mikdash. So there definitely are people that will do kriya. Mostly people find a way to get out of it by, like, I remember this going back to 30 years ago. Before first time I was in Israel was after high school. So the whole trick we all did was the first time you're going to Yerushalayim, going to go see the Kotel, not Yerushalayim, but go see the Kotel, you borrow somebody else's shirt. So that you don't have to do kriya on it. And then the real trick was you don't even borrow somebody else's shirt. You say, I'll sell you my shirt. So then you keep on, you wear this shirt. I say, you want to buy my shirt for today? And I'll keep on wearing it. And then I don't have to do kriya. So we're actually going to see that case coming up.
Even though it has like something on it now? Meaning I figure, I envision like this, small.
You mean the Harabais? Well, how is the Harabais less b'chorbanah than it was because it has the dome of the rock? Yeah. Right. So the question is, yeah. All right. So Tanu Rabbanan. I'm not getting into politics. Tanu Rabbanan. What? Right. So that was the other thing. If you go Friday afternoon or a Shabbos, so then you're not known to kriya. Then there are all these tricks of getting out of it. And then if you make sure to see it within every 30 days, so it's not like a new thing. Anyway, but it is true. Less and less I hear people worried about that today. So I don't know. It seems that yeah, I don't know. It's a good point. Like how much people are. Yes.
Also about that, it seems that looking to demand that you should shave yourself.
Yeah. As Tozo said, we're sort of picking and choosing. Tanu Rabbanan. Hayod say, so actually, Bevega Karua, if somebody goes out with a rent garment, it was already rent, Vifnei Hamet, in front of a dead body, Hareza goes out to Meisim V'Zachayim. You steal from the dead, you don't give them the right respect because your garment was already rent, and you're stealing from the living, you're deceiving them, right? Knevas Das, you're making it look like you rent your garment when you did not. Somebody who says to his friend, here's this case, now this is not a trick. I mean, I don't want to skew your interpretation of this. The whole point here is dafka not a trick. Somebody's father is sick. The question here is it's taken for granted that the person does not do kriya if the garment is not his own. But what happens, when is it implicit when he borrowed it? Here he's borrowing the suit. I'd like to borrow your nice suit. I'm going to go visit my father. He wasn't borrowing it as a trick. He was borrowing it so he would look nice when he went to visit his father. But how much did the person lending him was aware that the father might pass away any moment and therefore was implicitly giving him permission to do kriya if necessary? So that's the question. Like if the guy was informing him that I'm going to visit my father who's on his deathbed and lend me your nice suit, maybe there's an implicit understanding that if you have to do kriya, you can do kriya on my garment. So let's take a look. Yeah, but if I'm telling you the circumstances, the guy was telling in which he was borrowing it, so maybe it was like an implicit allowance to use it for that if necessary.
And once he's wearing it, if he's got a balut on the...
Well, yes. So that would be because the reason a person does not do kriya on his own on a borrowed garment is not like you don't put tzitzis on a talis that isn't yours because you have to own it in order to be chayiv in tzitzis. It's not like you have to own a garment in order to be chayiv to do kriya in it. You're not allowed to do kriya because it's damaging somebody else's property. Right. So if the person has implicitly acknowledged that you might have to do that and implicitly allowed you to do that, then you would do kriya. So let's read the case, okay? So, and then he went to visit his father, and the father had already passed away when he was there. Korea, so he does kriya because the guy who lent him the garment was somewhat aware that might happen. But even though it's a father, he actually now, just because he was allowed to do the act of kriya, he still has a responsibility to restore the object to as whole of a state as possible. It's an interesting middle ground. The guy gave him some implicit permission, but only as limited as possible. So then he does ichoy, which is generally not allowed for father. When he gets home, he returns the garment, and pays for how much it's been depreciated because of the tear, even with the tear and the repair. It's not like it's never been. So there's a limited permission, enough to do the act, but not enough that the person doesn't responsible financially for the cost, or that the person doesn't have to correct it as much as possible. So that's sort of what's being interpreted. Vim lo hodio, but if he didn't say, I'm going to go the circumstances of why he was borrowing it, hareze lo yigabo, then he can't touch it. It's not his property. Okay, so quite fascinating, like the limited allowance that we're going to interpret was given there. Tanu Rabbanan. Chodesh shemes lo meis. Now, this happens quite, on a not infrequent basis, that people are, a family decides not to tell, somebody about a death, somebody very elderly, and whatever, and that the death, hearing about a sibling that died, let's say, would be, they figure the person would not be able to handle the information. So here we have that situation. Cholish shemez lo meis, a sick person doesn't stop mean sick, somebody who's like very deathly ill. And somebody died, ein modiin or so. You do not inform. You actually, the halacha is you don't inform the person. Obviously, you have to know what the circumstances are. But but if the following concern is present, shema ein modiin or so shemeis shema titaref da'ato alav, lest it cause him to be, his mind, his emotion disturbed, and that could actually, injure his state of health. The ein mekarin befanav, and you would not do kriya in his presence when you go to visit this other, this elderly relative. You don't have your rent garments on from the fact that you're sitting shiva for somebody else. Umishatkinas hanashim panav, very interesting sociological phenomenon here. You keep the women silent, presumably a concern that women would not be able to.
Well, the whalers.
Oh, you mean it means the whalers? Oh, okay. All right, thank you for that. That's better. Okay, umikarin lekatan mipnei agmas nefesh. Now we're sort of moving away from this person who is sick and can't find, and you want to protect him from this information to other people. So now let's see. So that's you prevent an elderly person from, or not elderly, excuse me, a deathly ill person from, or a precariously ill person from finding out. And therefore, in a way, this person isn't sitting shiva, even though they should technically be it, but it's more important to protect them from that information. And now, somewhat in the reverse, a minor who's not obligated to do observances of shiva, you still do kriya for the katan, meaning on the katan's garments, b'pnei agmas nefesh, because it leads to like a distressed soul, meaning in what's normally explained is not for the katan, but for everybody else. It just makes it that much more tragic. And now, so here also more mourning practices that either, the first one is not being done when it, in way, halachically was obligated, and here being done when it's not fully obligated. So a person would go ahead and do kriya for his father-in-law and mother-in-law. All of this said in the male perspective, but obviously true for the female as well. Out of respect for his wife. What? I don't think we do this. For Amar Papa Tanav Rabasi, we taught in Rabasi, which is in Maseches Machos. Aval lo yaniach tinok b'tocheko. An aval should not put an infant in his lap. Mipnei shemivioli de schok. It leads him to sort of laughing. And that causes him to be, seen unseemly in the eyes of other people. What are you doing? You're supposed to be sitting shiva here. You are. You're playing around. You're laughing. It's actually a funny. It's an interesting halacha which people grapple with, because first of all, what if it's the person's own kid? What if it's for it's an act of comfort, not an act of playing around, but there's something that's comforting about that. So in different situations, people treat this more or less in absolute terms. I mean, what I've tended to see is people might for a minute take but not overly do this. But again, this is something that people find challenging. But the Gemara gives a specific reason about schok and mitkaneh and so on, and one wonders if different contexts would make that different. Let's try to just read to the bottom of the page so we won't be more than a daf behind. Now, when it comes time to give that first meal after the cemetery, it is not done on upright beds, but on overturned beds. Only on upright beds. And the question, of course, here is the context during Chol Moed? I mentioned to you that question in the Mishnah, and therefore the beds are not upturned; they're in their right position, or is it the context even in general? It's not clear. Let's read what the Gemara says. Tanura Banan, Haholech lebeis ha'avel, im haya libo gaspo. Person goes to the house of a mourner. If he's very comfortable with him, very intimate and friendly. Yavruhu al mitot kfuyot. So then the avel sits on an upturned bed, and the person feeding the avel, this is the first meal after the cemetery, maybe even the first day, sits together with him on an upturned bed and feeds him. It can that's an acceptable intimacy, even though they're both on the upturned bed. But if he doesn't feel comfortable with him, yavru al mitot zekufot, it should be a the bed should be, or the couch, whatever, should be in its upright position. Now the question is, are they both on upright couches? If it's not Chol HaMoed, again, if it's Chol HaMoed, then it would, then regardless of if you feel comfortable or not, it should be upright couches. If it's not Chol HaMoed, so then it might mean that the Avel is on an upturned bed, and the person that's not so intimate and comfortable with the Avel should be on the bed in the upright position. Rava Isra Milsa. Rava had a death in the family. Al Gabe Abba Bar Marta. So Abba Bar Marta came to visit him. Dehu Abba Bar Minyomi. Rava Zakif. So Rava was on an upright bed. Abba Bar Marta Kafi. And Abba Bar Marta, who wasn't the Avel, was the one feeding Rava, was on an upturned bed. So Rava said, Kama leis beidata lahai tuber mirabanan. How much does this rabbinic student not have it and doesn't know what he's doing? He's on an upturned bed, and here the Avel's on an upright bed. Now, what was Rava doing on an upright bed? Again, we might be talking about Chol HaMoed. It's a major debate in the Rishonim how to read this. But whatever it was, the fact that the Menachem was on the upturned bed when the Avel was on the upright bed, clearly he said, what does he know? He doesn't even know what he's doing. Okay, we will, I guess, pick up with this tomorrow. Full daf behind.